Alright, so lastly, we're going to do this in radians. Put it all together with the radians here. So we've got this piece here that affects the x's, and these affect the y's. So here we're going to have x plus pi over 2, and we're going to have y divided by 2 plus 2. So now, starting off, 0 plus pi over 2 is pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is pi. Pi plus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 2 pi, and 2 pi plus pi over 2 is going to be 5 pi over 2. Okay, and so now with the y's, it's signed, so we're starting at 0. 0 divided by 2 is 0, plus 2 is 2. 1, we get 2.5. 0, negative 1, and back to 0. Okay, so set your scale. Pi over 2, 5 pi over 2, halfway, 3 pi over 2, halfway pi, halfway 2 pi. Now we max out at 2.5, then we have a 2, and then we have a 1.5. Now you just plot your points. Middle, top, middle, bottom, middle. Connect the dots with your curve. All done. Okay, over here, that affects the x's. These affect the y's. So here we're going to have x minus pi over 2, and then we're going to have 3y plus 1. And so 0 minus pi over 2 is negative pi over 2. Pi over 2 minus pi over 2 is 0. Pi minus pi over 2 is pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 minus pi over 2 is pi. And 2 pi minus pi over 2 is 3 pi over 2. Okay, so now our y values, it's cosine, so you're starting at 1. So that'd be 3 plus 1 is 4. At 0, it goes back to 1. At negative 1, that should go to negative 2. And then it should follow the same pattern back out, 1, 4. So now, let's put them in there. We got negative pi over 2. We got 0. We've got pi over 2. We've got pi. And we've got 3 pi over 2. And we top out at 4. Bottom out at negative 2. And halfway is 1. So here we go. So plot your points. So we start at the top, go to the middle, to the bottom, to the middle, and to the top. And there you go. And if you find yourself putting these 2 points at the 0, 1 and the pi 1 down on the x-axis, you may want to possibly take your pencil and just lightly kind of draw a straight line across so that you put these points in the right spot so that they are on that line and look like they're close to it. Okay, because sometimes people will put it on the x-axis when it doesn't go on the x-axis. Okay, 9, analyze. That changes your x. These change your y's. And so here we go. So on this, we get x minus pi over 4, and then we have y over 2 plus 2. So 0 minus pi over 4 is negative pi over 4. Pi over 2 becomes pi over 4. Pi becomes 3 pi over 4. Then we're going to get 5 pi over 4 and 7 pi over 4. Okay? So since cosine we're starting at 1, that's going to be at 2.5, and then at 0, then at -1, and then back the same way. So now set your scale. There's going to be negative pi over 4, pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, and 5 pi over 4, and 7 pi over 4. Okay, and we top off at 2.5, bottom out at 1.5, and in between we have 2. So go ahead and graph. Start at the top, to the middle, to the bottom, to the middle, to the top. And we draw our curve. And we're done. Okay? So, same thing here. Analyze. That affects our x's. These affect our y's. So we have x minus pi over 4. Do the opposite operation with the x's. And then we have 2y minus 2. So, this is the same thing as last time. So our x's are going to stay negative pi over 4, pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4. And so now since it's cosine, you start at the top. So 1 times 2 is 2, minus 2 is 0. Then 0, and then -1. And then it'll fall back out the same way it came in. So here we go. We got negative pi over 4, pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4. Okay? And we top out at 0, and we bottom out at -4, and halfway is -2. So now go ahead and plot your points. So top, middle, bottom, middle, top. Draw your curve, and there you go. Okay? 11 affects your x's, affects your y's. And so now with our table, we're going to have x plus 3 pi over 4, and then we're going to do y divided by 2 minus 2. So starting off, 0 plus 3 pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. Pi over 2 plus 3 pi over 4 is 5 pi over 4. And then pi plus 3 pi over 4 is going to be 7 pi over 4. And as you can see, that pattern, we're always going up 2 pi in the numerator. And so we'll finish at 11 pi over 4. Now, sine, you start at 0, so that means -2 to 1, -1.5, back to 0, -1, and then back to 0. Okay? So, set your scale. We got 3 pi over 4, end at 11 pi over 4, halfway is 7 pi over 4, halfway here is 5 pi over 4, and halfway here is 9 pi over 4. Now, the highest we go up is -1/2. The lowest we go is -2.5, and in the middle is -2. So now plot your points. It starts at in the middle, to the top, to the middle, to the bottom, to the middle, and draw your graph. Okay? And the last one, number 12 here, again, analyze. boom. That affects our x's. These affect our y's. And so we have x plus 3 pi over 4. And then we have 2 times y minus 1. So here, it's exactly like the last one. So we start with 3 pi over 4. And then we go to 5 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, 9 pi over 4, 11 pi over 4. Okay? And so now here, your cosine, so you're starting at 1. 2 times 1 is 2, minus 1 is 1. 0 times 2 is 0, minus 1 is negative 1. Negative 1 times 2 is negative 2, minus 1 is negative 3. And we go back the way we came. And here we go, set up our scale again. So here we have 3 pi over 4 goes to 11 pi over 4. Halfway is 7 pi over 4. Halfway is 5 pi over 4. And halfway here is 9 pi over 4. Okay, so 1 is where we top out. Negative 3 is where we bottom out, and negative 1 is halfway. So now plot your points. We're at the top, to the middle, to the bottom, to the middle, to the top. Draw in your curve. And there we go, let's continue it. There we go. And we're done. And that should be all the graphing I can help you with. Good luck.